Our first speaker is a professor of post-colonial literature and women and gender studies at George Mason University. Oops, I think I did this slide. Okay, there we go. She has a PhD from Boston University, and she's organizing a panel discussion at the upcoming Middle Eastern Studies Association Conference on Gays and Lesbians in the Middle East. Please welcome Dr. Amal Amireh. There's some seats in the front.
This one is on.
There's some seats in the front for those of you standing. There's like 4 or 5 over here. And there's some over there.
Speaking about homosexuality and Islam is risky. Not speaking about homosexuality and Islam is riskier. Let me explain what I mean. These days, Muslims in America and elsewhere live under a microscope. Since 9/11, Muslims have been subjected to unprecedented scrutiny. Interest in everything Islamic is at records high, mostly motivated by a know-thy-enemy attitude that does not leave much room for fresh knowledge, but relies instead on recycling cliches, stereotypes, and other prepackaged Orientalist wares that unfortunately does not advance our knowledge of Islam. Instead, it reproduces our ignorance of both Islam and Muslims. The dominant discourse about Islam in this country and the West more generally centers on its so-called exceptionalism. It is Islam, that is rarely discussed alongside other religions where there is a risk of seeing similarity and continuity. Instead, it is viewed as an exceptional religion, particularly and essentially different from the 2 other monotheistic religions, Judaism and Christianity. In fact, Islam is often talked about in opposition to these 2 religions. How different would our panel today be if it were titled Religion and Homosexuality instead of Islam and Homosexuality? One of the consequences of Orientalist discourse about Islam's exceptionalism is that Muslim in this country has become a racial slur. We need not look further than this election campaign. The N-word, thanks to a long history of anti-racist struggle, is no longer acceptable in public discourse. But unfortunately, it has been replaced by the M-word. Muslims are seen as other, violent, backward, unpatriotic, irrationally attached to an atavistic religion that does not belong to the civilized world. Sexuality always plays a central role in discourses of difference. Sexuality has a great potential for othering. In times past, and under the influence of the medieval church, for instance, Muslims were seen as sexually too permissive, actually licentious, having too much sex, and having their own kind of sex. They even, the accusation was, they even had poets who composed homoerotic poems and had caliphs who loved other men openly, the horror. But since the sexual revolution, Muslims have been accused of the opposite, of being too sexually repressed and repressive. Typically, it has been the Muslim woman, oppressed, eroticized, veiled, and submissive, that stood simultaneously as a representative of the otherness of Islam and as its victim, who can only be pitied or saved. But more recently, the Muslim homosexual has emerged alongside the veiled woman as the figure in much need of rescue, who must be saved from his own religion and culture. The persecuted homosexual has emerged as a symbol for Islam's essential difference and has become a key figure in the us versus them rhetoric of those who believe in a clash of civilizations and cultures. As a result, the Muslim homosexual is sometimes viewed just the way the veiled woman before him was used to further political agendas that has nothing to do with gay liberation or gender justice. The parading, I'll give one example, the parading of a gay Palestinian man in American university campuses to speak about how bad the Palestinian Authority is towards gays compared to how wonderful Israel is, has nothing to do with furthering gay rights in Palestine. It aims at discrediting the Palestinian Authority and with it the Palestinian national cause. Just as those who championed liberating the women of Afghanistan in 2002 from their burqas didn't give a fig about women's rights either in Afghanistan or in this country. We need to be wary then that in some quarters, talking about Islam and homosexuality aims at one thing only, discrediting Islam. Unfortunately, our conversation today takes place within this context of Islamophobia. This is why I believe it was important to mention this right from the beginning. But this is not the only context in which our conversation is taking place. Another related one is a context of denial, best represented by Ahmadinejad's statement during his visit to Columbia University not long ago, that there are no homosexuals in Iran. Perhaps what he meant is that since there are laws against homosexuality in Iran, and since all Iranians are law-abiding citizens, there are no homosexuals in Iran. It could also be that there are no homosexuals in Iran because Iranians who love people of the same sex find it easier to undergo sex change operations permitted under Iranian law in order to be with the ones they love. Or perhaps what he meant is that it is what sadly is fashionable in some intellectual circles these days. There are no homosexuals in Iran because homosexual, gay, lesbian, and queer are all Western manufactured labels, just like Coca-Cola being imposed on Muslims or Arabs or Africans, who may engage in homosexual acts but can never, ever, ever have homosexual identities. While it is important to view sexual practices and identities in their cultural context, it is dangerous when this sensitivity to local context becomes a politics of denial. One recent book by actually a friend of mine went as far as to claim that those who identify as gay and lesbians in the Arab and Muslim world are native informants, that is, unauthentic Arabs and Muslims, sellouts with no representation and legitimacy. While it is understandable, again, that this view is often expressed in reaction to the condescending Orientalist discourse I mentioned earlier, it does end up denying the agency of the Muslims it seeks to empower. This rhetoric, coming in this case from the left, sadly coincides with the rhetoric of conservative clerks and politicians like Ahmadinejad, who insist that gayness, like feminism and human rights, is a Western invention. People like Ahmadinejad and my friend are challenged every day by men and women who do indeed identify as Muslim and as gays, lesbian, bisexuals, transsexuals, transgendered, and queer, either individually or through groups like Fatiha, Allied in Pride, Responsive Tonight's panel, and also groups like Aswat, Voices, an organization of gay Palestinian women, or DREAM, an organization of Lebanese queers, or ME, an organization of Lebanese lesbians. These men and women are real and are as authentic as those men and women who may have homosexual sex but not embrace a gay, lesbian, or queer identity. Both groups exist, and if you think about it, that's not really very different from how it is here and elsewhere. Furthermore, many of those people insist on a Muslim and a gay queer identity. They refuse to choose one or the other. If we, as Muslims, don't want others to speak for us, if we need to speak up for ourselves and for our own. And if we can't speak for some reason, we must at least listen to each other in all our diversity. To dismiss these people as native informants, as inauthentic, as infected by a Western disease or label, is to deploy a politics of denial that is as pernicious as Islamophobia. And to explain why this is dangerous, I move on now to the third context in which our conversation is taking place, the context of homophobia. We may argue about the existence or not of Muslim gays and lesbians, but we can't doubt for a second the existence of homophobia. The politics of denial allows for a politics of homophobia. Men and women who identify as gay or are identified by others as gay, or who don't identify as gay but engage in homosexual acts, or even look as if they can engage in homosexual acts, are subjected to attacks, verbal, physical, and legal. The infamous Queen boat case in Egypt, one example. Dubai recently is in the habit of crashing what they identify as gay parties and sentencing people they label as gay to jail. Kuwait wants to pass a law that punishes men and women who do not look or walk like men and women are supposed to look and walk. Morocco is witnessing more gay organizing and more homophobia. Even if you don't believe that gays or queers exist in Muslim society, you still have a moral duty to speak up against attacks on them. They are discriminated against, and we must speak up against this discrimination. But we must remember that such discrimination is not monopolized by Islam and Muslims. Homophobia, alas, is global. So let me conclude. We can talk about Islam and homosexuality without being Islamophobic. In other words, we can stand up for homosexuals in Iran and at the same time be against bombing the country to smithereens. We can talk about Islam and homosexuality without being homophobic. The response to Muslim bashing is not a politics of denial that encourages or at best is complicit with homophobia. The response to gay bashing is not a politics that demonizes Islam and Muslims. I sincerely believe that we can do both. We can speak up against Islamophobia and against homophobia if we are seeking a just world for everyone. I do hope that we can do that here tonight. Thank you.